were going well for Weldon Angelos, a 22-year-old up-and-coming record producer in Salt Lake City. But as the New York Times of January 11, 2006 explains, Angelos' life came crashing down around him in 2003, when a federal jury convicted him of selling marijuana on 3 separate occasions. According to the sentencing decision filed in the U.S. District Court in Utah on November 16, 2004, Angelos carried a gun with him when he made 2 of these sales, though he didn't use or even display the gun. Its very presence at the drug deals forced the judge to sentence him, under federal mandatory minimum laws, to 55 years in prison. The sentencing decision noted that if Angelos had provided weapons to a terrorist organization, hijacked an aircraft, committed second-degree murder, and raped a 10-year-old child, he would have received a lower combined sentence than he got for selling about $1,000 worth of marijuana. According to a November 23, 2004 Slate.com article, there are over 100 federal mandatory minimum sentencing provisions which require judges to sentence perpetrators of specific crimes to fixed minimum terms. Despite the fact that the New Criminologist of November 20, 2005 tells us that rates of violent crime have been declining steadily for over 10 years, the Center for Policy Alternatives website Copyright 2006 states that since they were enacted, mandatory minimums have increased prison costs by over $4 billion. So in order to fight these laws that make a mockery of our constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, we must first examine the dangers of mandatory minimums. Next, explore the steps that the Supreme Court and Congress can take to eliminate these unfair laws before examining how the world will look once mandatory minimums are done away with. When that's all done, we'll finally discuss what each of us can do to eliminate these unfair sentencing policies. Initially, the problems with mandatory minimums can be divided in 2 ways. First, they impose overly harsh sentences, and next, they prevent any chance of rehabilitating criminals. Because mandatory minimums lay out blanket sentences for all defendants who commit a particular crime, they pay no attention to the factors involved in an individual defendant's actions, which traditional judge or jury sentencing can take into account. The St. Petersburg Times of May 17, 2005 reports that defendants sentenced under mandatory minimum laws often receive 10, 15, 20 years or more in prison for nonviolent, first-time offenses. According to the website of the Drug Policy Alliance, Copyright 2006, 18-year-old Nicole Richardson learned about these unfair laws firsthand when her boyfriend sold drugs to an undercover agent. Nicole had nothing to do with the sale, but when she answered her telephone and gave another undercover agent the phone number where her boyfriend could be reached, she was charged with involvement in a drug-dealing conspiracy and given a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. Even in cases where defendants commit more serious crimes than handing out a phone number, the 8th Amendment of our Constitution mandates a sentence that is proportionate to the offense, rather than predetermined justice. Mandatory minimums also are problematic because they prevent any chance of rehabilitating criminals. A 2004 report from the Justice Policy Institute notes that rehabilitation programs work better than imprisonment to reduce recidivism and substance abuse, and are a much less expensive option than incarceration. For example, Maryland's use of treatment programs has lowered its annual cost per offender from $20,000 to only $4,000. Despite this, when a defendant is facing a mandatory minimum, the judge in the case cannot choose to send him or her to a rehab program, even if the judge feels that the defendant and society would be better served by doing so. Now that we have examined the dangers of mandatory minimums, we must explore the steps that the Supreme Court and Congress can take to eliminate these unfair policies. Initially, the Supreme Court must produce clear precedent on the issue of mandatory minimums. The Deseret Morning News of January 11, 2006 reports that lawyers for Weldon Angelos are considering appealing his case directly to the Supreme Court. In his ruling, the Utah District Court Judge Paul Castle noted that he believed that Angelos' sentence was cruel and unusual, but that he couldn't ignore the mandatory minimum law because the Supreme Court has failed to produce clear precedent on this issue. The justices must accept this case and use the opportunity to clearly explain what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Next, Congress must eliminate mandatory minimums and let judges do their jobs. The trial process is designed to ensure that judges know the circumstances of a defendant's case before making a decision, a factor that mandatory minimum statutes ignore completely. And according to a June 23, 2005 press release from Families Against Mandatory Minimums, prosecutors can even appeal sentences if they believe judges are being too lenient. Thus, if Congress were to eliminate mandatory minimums, judges would be able to hand out fairer sentences tailored to defendants, and the appellate system would ensure that those sentences were appropriate. Now that we've examined the steps that the Supreme Court and Congress can take to eliminate mandatory minimums, we must explore what the world will look like once mandatory minimums are done away with. The most important thing that will occur is that our justice system will become inherently more fair, because each defendant will have the circumstances of their case explored by a judge individually, rather than just receiving a blanket sentence laid down for all defendants. Even more importantly, perhaps, though, is the idea that the judiciary will become more independent of Congress. If Congress no longer lays out the exact sentences that judges must give defendants, this means that the judiciary will be able to make independent decisions and won't be so interfered with by Congress. Thus, if mandatory minimums no longer exist in the United States, defendants will be able to receive individualized sentences that are more fair than the blanket sentences they are receiving now, and our judiciary will be more independent. After examining all of these things, it is finally imperative that we explore the steps that each of us can take to discuss how mandatory minimums can be eliminated. First and foremost, we must fundamentally alter the way we view criminals. It isn't easy to have sympathy for people who break the law, but locking them up for decades does nothing to make our country a safer place. The first step to ensuring that criminals can be rehabilitated instead of discarded is to eliminate mandatory minimum laws. Use the website mandatorymadness.org to let your representatives know that they should vote against proposed mandatory minimum bills. Also, research your political candidates' positions on the justice system and let them know at the ballot box just how detestable mandatory minimums are. Members of Congress enact these laws to garner favor with voters. So the best way to combat them is to let our representatives know that we do not approve. Because of mandatory minimum laws, 22-year-old Weldon Angelos is facing what amounts to a life sentence for selling pot. After examining the dangers of mandatory minimums, the steps that the Supreme Court and Congress can take to eliminate them, what the U.S. justice system will look like once they're gone, and finally what each of us can do to make this better future come about. Hopefully we are finally a little bit closer to restoring some justice to our justice system.